All right. Hello, Doc. My presentation is on Chapter 49, Intro to Ecology. And, yep. So, ecology is the study of how organisms interact with each other and their environment. Its goal is to understand the distribution and abundance of organisms. Ecology answers the who, what, where, and why of organisms. So, basically, ecology just tells us why organisms act the way they do, what their end goal is, and how different organisms' relationships cause ripple effects in their environment. Okay, next slide. So there's 5 types of ecological study. So the first one is organismal ecology. So this is the study of how individuals react with others in the environment. So this is just basically a study of, how different species um, work with each other and like how some species prey on others, and just the relationships between these species. Population ecology studies how population size changes over time. So the study uses different factors. It studies how different factors affect the population and how moving species in and out can change the population of certain species and the population as a whole. So the next one is community ecology. So this just studies how species interact. So yeah, it's similar to community, but I mean it's similar to organismal ecology, but this one is more based on species rather than individuals. The individuals can be um, organisms within the same species, how they react with each other, how they help out each other, basically. Okay, so the next one is ecosystem ecology. This is studies how energy flows through an environment. Um, Community ecology can really tie into this one because ecosystem ecology, it studies how, for example, how the food web works, how energy um, flows from the producers up until the like apex predators of a certain environment, and this can go with community ecology because um, this studies how species interact. So it shows like how some species prey on others, basically, and how if you remove one species, how that can change a food web and change how energy flows through an environment. So the last one is global ecology. This studies how the biosphere is affected by changes in nutrient cycle and climate. So this is just studying how changes in an environment can change the atmosphere and just the world as a whole, pretty much. So next slide, the origin of ecology. So Ernst Haeckel defined ecology in 1859. Obviously, this is a root word for ecology. He was inspired by Darwin. He actually defined this term after reading one of Darwin's books. So ecology and evolution are very intertwined because ecology studies how organisms react with each other, and that can cause them to evolve. So that goes hand in hand with Darwin's theories. So next, we have ecology now. So our world is ever changing right now because as the population grows, there's so many different factors in the world and our environment. So ecology is extremely relevant now. This is because humans are causing extreme changes to the environment. Humans have massive impact on the environment in today's age. Our health and welfare depends on a solid understanding of ecology and how it affects us. So, in order to survive in this ever changing world, and as resources are becoming more scarce and the atmosphere is becoming less healthy, we really have to have an understanding of ecology so we can help reverse some of these effects, and the ones that are irreversible, we have to learn how to live with. So, this is very important to have a solid understanding of ecology right now in order to survive as a species for thousands of more years. So, next, these are just some important terms that we will be hearing in the rest of this chapter. So the population is a group of individuals of the same species that lives in the same area that lives in the same area. Community consists of populations of different species that interact with each other in a particular area. So population and community, they're different. They're similar, but they're different. Population is again of the same species, and community is all the different species that live together in one environment and how they interact. So this is a typo. It's not supposed to be Mars. a thin zone surrounding the Earth where all lives exist. This is the biosphere. So that's just pretty much where we live, where all organisms exist. The next is the ecosystem, consists of all organisms in a particular region along with non-living components. So the ecosystem is not only the organisms, it's also the non-living components like water, like soil, and how they all interact. That's like one of the main points of ecology, just studying how everything interacts in an environment. Um, Abiotic, pretty simple, non-living. Biotic, living. A means not, so abiotic therefore is non-living. Next slide. So conservation biology. This is the effort to study, preserve, and restore threatened genetic diversity in populations and species. Conservation biologists prescribe the earth with ways to remedy threats to biodiversity. So biodiversity is extremely important because the more diversity we have that a species have, the more chance they have of surviving and adapting to be a stronger species in the future, because the larger their gene pool is, the more chance they have to adapt and be successful. So if a species is not very diverse, and there's some factors that can hurt that non-diverse species, that species really has limited chances to adapt and survive in the future. So that is why biodiversity is so important. So conservation biologists really in charge themselves with keeping biodiversity, so that species can be healthy in the future. So here are some abiotic factors that can affect organisms. So the organisms cannot survive in every environment. This is pretty obvious. I mean, the polar bear can't survive in the desert. There's just certain factors that limit them. Abiotic factors determine the niche of an organism. A niche is the range of conditions that a species can tolerate. Some examples of abiotic factors are temperature and water. So a niche is basically just where a species can live based on their attributes, and they need to align with the attributes of that environment. Organisms obviously tend to exist where they can survive and thrive. So again, with the polar bear in the desert, as you can see, some examples of abiotic factors are temperature and water. The polar bear is not accustomed to hot temperatures. Its fur is meant for cold temperatures. It would overheat and probably die in a desert. So that is why it lives in the colder areas, and it has adapted for those areas as well. So it can't just be uprooted and moved because there's certain abiotic factors that just limit species. So next, here are some biotic factors. Biotic again means living. Drop the A, which means no. So that means these factors are living. An organism's niche is also determined by biotic factors. Competition with other species is a huge factor that determines where species can thrive. Some species are dependent on other species, so they can only exist where the other species exists. So, this pretty much just means an organism can only live and thrive where it is allowed to live and thrive. So if there is a predator that is just absolutely destroying that population, it'll be very difficult for that organism to thrive there. So maybe that's not the best environment for them. So that's a biotic factor because the competition and the predation, I mean, those organisms are living, so therefore it is biotic. Some species are dependent on each other, so this just means that they need each other to survive. A solid example of this would be those birds that eat off of rhinoceroses. There's birds that eat the leeches off of them. Without those birds, the rhinoceroses would struggle because they're constantly being leeched on, and they can't live that way. And on the other side, the bird needs the rhinoceroses for there to be leeches so that it has food to eat. So those two need to live with each other so they can both exist. If you take away the bird, the rhinoceros would struggle, and if you take away the rhinoceros, the bird would struggle in turn. So it's kind of a give and take, and some species just need each other. So next, interaction of these factors. Biologists can predict where animals can exist based on these factors. They use niche models to find how certain conditions might affect certain organisms. This allows scientists to be able to protect biodiversity by taking action before changes like climate change can happen. Scientists work on studies to find exact measurements of factors in order to predict how they will interact. So basically, these are kind of predictable. Like you can predict that the rhinoceros would not survive without the bird. Um, so yeah, scientists are just constantly at work using models to just make sure that biodiversity is not threatened, and they're just kind of being a guardian because humans have brought a lot of this change to the earth. These scientists believe it is their responsibility to preserve this biodiversity to undo all the negative effects humans have caused. So yeah, they just try to foresee changes that could threaten species, and they just use studies and models to get kind of a head start on this and be able to take action before serious threats to these populations happen. So next we have climate. Climate is the prevailing long-term weather conditions found in an area, weather-specific short-term atmospheric conditions of temperature, precipitation, sunlight, and wind. So climate, it's just the average over time. So for example, El Paso would be considered hot and dry. However, El Paso, this is where weather is different. El Paso could have one day where it is super cold and rainy in the summer, but you wouldn't call that normal. So therefore, it wouldn't be its climate. It would just be its weather on that singular day. Therefore, it's short term. So just climate long term, weather short term, basically. So over time, El Paso will be more dry and hot. In the short term, El Paso could possibly have a rainy day. That's just there's variations day to day. So Why is weather different around the world? So obviously, weather's not uniform throughout the world. The equators around the equator is a lot more hot and humid. In the poles, it can be very cold and very dry. The poles are cold because they do not receive much direct sunlight. The Earth is obviously tilted, so it's at an angle, and the pole, as the globe kind of makes its circle, the globe is further away from the sun, and it doesn't get that direct sunlight that the equator does. The equator is sticking out compared to the poles, so it's just hit directly by the sun, and that is why it's a lot warmer in the equator. Next, why are they wet? So this is the areas around the equator have significant rainfall. The Hadley cell is a major cycle in global air circulation that is responsible for making the Amazon River wet and the Sahara Desert dry. This cell results in higher levels of precipitation. So yeah, this is what is responsible for making the tropics wet. The tropics are obviously, very wet and humid, and other places are not. And the Hadley cell is responsible for making this happen. The Coriolis effect. This is the air that causes this pattern of moisture. The air does not move in straight directions. Basically, like it doesn't move north or south or west or east. The Earth is obviously constantly rotating, so this causes an effect which is called the Coriolis effect. This causes the wind to, move in sporadic directions because of the spherical nature of the globe. So, what causes seasons? So again, as I mentioned before, the Earth is obviously tilted. So as you can see in this diagram, at certain points in the Earth's rotation, different parts of the globe are tilted towards the sun. So that is what causes seasons. When you're tilted towards the sun, when your part of the globe is tilted towards the sun, you're receiving more direct sunlight, and therefore you are in summer. When you're tilting away from the sun, as you can see here, this part of the globe would be facing winter, while the southern part would be facing summer. So the tilting of Earth causes different parts of the Earth to get more sunlight during different parts of the year. This is why the northern and southern hemispheres experience opposite seasons at the same time. So in the north, when it is summer, in the south, it will be winter. Landforms effect on climate. So regional features have an effect on the climate of an area. Mountains can cause changes in moisture through what is called a rain shadow. Oceans can cause effects on the temperature of an area. Water has a very high specific heat, which means it can store lots of energy. Area with oceans have more moderate temperatures because of this. So we actually see this in El Paso. So the regional features we have, the mountain, we see, especially if you live by the mountain, you see extremely high winds because the wind just comes off the mountain, and the mountain almost accelerates that wind. So that is a regional feature of El Paso. That is why it can get so windy here. That's one of the reasons why it can get so windy here, And even you can see this, it's kind of like in a microcosm here, because on the west side of El Paso, again, by the mountain, it can be very windy. And then on the east side, maybe you don't get any wind because the wind is flowing over the mountain and it's accelerating down onto the west side. So yeah, obviously this occurs in bigger and smaller scales. So yeah, and there's also what is called a rain shadow. That is what it is depicted here. So the moisture air blows onshore, the air rises over mountains and cools, and the rain falls on this side of the mountain. And on the other side, the moisture doesn't reach that other side. So this is where the rain shadow is. Um, and you just don't get any moisture over here. So the oceans have what is called high specific heat. So this just means they can absorb lots of energy. Heat is energy, therefore can absorb lots of heat. So yeah, this is why you see areas around the ocean might have more moderate temperatures over the year. This doesn't mean like for an example, like California. It's like very nice and sunny during the summer, but it doesn't get insanely hot like right by the ocean. It may be like 80 or 90, which is still warm, but it's not extremely hot. But then in the winter, you don't see it drop more. You don't see it drop below like 50 at some points if you're right on the ocean. So this is just because the water kind of has a regulating effect. It just it can absorb the heat and just kind of regulate the heat in that area. All right, next, terrestrial biomes. So organisms change from biome to biome. So you'll find, if you go in the desert, you'll find the different organisms than if you go into the forest. Vegetation and life forms vary greatly as you move across biomes. So a cactus won't survive in the rainforest, and a rainforest tree won't survive in the desert. Biomes are regions that are characterized by abiotic characteristics and dominant types of vegetation. So yeah, they're just abiotic characteristics would be water, soil. So these are different in different biomes. We don't have an ocean in the desert. And yeah, so there are several types of biomes. Yeah, and they change throughout the world. So next, natural biomes. Different ecosystems can belong to the same biome. This is due to historical biotic and abiotic factors. Several abiotic conditions determine where these biomes exist. So, yeah, so we can just see here, there's different ecosystems in the same biome, which means there's different communities. Different organisms can exist, but you won't find drastically different vegetation and organisms throughout the same biome. So this is just different types of biomes here: tundra forest, boreal forest, temperate grassland, subtropical desert, tropical wet forest. And as you see, as you go down, the biomes become like more warm weather biomes. So here, Arctic tundra, obviously very cold. Boreal forest, it's kind of like a colder forest. Temperate kind of in the name, temperate grassland. And then as you come down, it's subtropical. And then you start getting tropical forests, and this is where it gets warmer and warmer and warmer near the equator again, as we discussed earlier. So next, factors that determine biomes. So these are abiotic factors. So temperature, only certain organisms can function in certain temperatures, like that example that we used of a polar bear before. Polar bear won't survive in the hot because it is so accustomed to the cold and has developed that thick fur. Moisture. Water is required for life. Therefore, only organisms accustomed to certain levels of moisture can live in certain biomes. Animals like lizards and snakes have adapted to not having that much water in the desert because there's not that much water available in the desert. But if you get animals from very wet areas, they might struggle to live in somewhere like the desert because they're accustomed to having so much water available to them. Sunlight, this is required for photosynthesis. This is especially important for plants. They need certain levels of sunlight to survive and thrive. Wind adds to the effect of temperature and moisture. Wind also has impacts on birds, insects, and plants. So temperature and moisture. Obviously, a 40-degree day where it's sunny and no wind feels a lot warmer than a 40-degree day where it is blowing wind. The wind just accentuates the temperature and the moisture as well. And also, for small organisms, especially flying organisms like birds and insects, the wind can just smack them out of the air, and that is a limiting factor on them because they may not be able to transport themselves very easily because of this wind. So next, anthropogenic biomes. Humans have caused a massive change in biomes across the globe. Models that show how biomes would look if they were allowed to evolve naturally are extremely different than what biomes actually look like. The large amount of land being used by humans greatly alters what biomes look like. In highly populated areas such as eastern North America, wildlife has grown extremely sparse. This shows the effect human activity has on nature. So, humans cause a change in biomes, obviously. As much as many humans would hate to admit it, we are kind of a destructive species. Again, I'm using the example of El Paso because it's extremely relevant. Before it was before a civilization was here, it was mostly desert. Animals were allowed to roam free. Now we have built into this desert. There's obviously less desert, and this is why we see things like we see coyotes and deer um, running through the residential areas because we have taken up their where they resided before. Um, okay, so yeah, the models that show how biomes would look if they were naturally allowed to evolve. So this is um, just again like those models we spoke about earlier, just using abiotic and biotic factors. Um, um, if humans haven't didn't taint these biomes, they would look a lot different than they do now. So animals constantly have to adapt to humans' destructive ways. And yeah, so the larger amount of land being used by humans greatly alters what biomes look like. Again, same kind of thing. Just humans are destructive and change what the world looks like. So yeah, especially in Eastern North America, it's very an urban area, obviously, lots of residential areas. So this used to be temperate forest, but now obviously New York City, you're not seeing many trees or many organisms roaming around because humans have just taken these biomes and changed them. So that's just the nature of the world right now. And so climate change, this goes hand in hand with like the industrialization of humans and how we're just spreading and taking up more land. Greenhouse gases are causing climate change. It is projected temperatures will rise 6 degrees Celsius over the next 100 years. This doesn't seem like a lot. Oh, only 6 degrees. But certain animals are just so used to their ways that this change can be extremely threatening to their survival. So, in an attempt to try to get ahead of this, ecologists use simulation studies, observational studies, historical studies, and experiments. So, simulation, this is just running models, seeing how certain things might affect, how certain factors might affect populations. Observational studies, this is just observing what is going on currently, like showing how climate change in these past few years has um, has changed has changed the world for these species. Historical studies is looking at the past, how biomes have changed over time, how the environment has changed, and why. And experiments, this is introducing uh, maybe changing some factors in an environment and seeing how that will affect the environment as a whole. So many experiments are being performed in the tundra to see how the change will affect the earth. So the tundra, it's kind of interesting because this is one of the spots that is being affected the most by global warming because the tundra is made up of a lot of glaciers and frozen water. So as temperatures rise, we see this begin to melt, and a change from ice to water can greatly change that environment. So from these experiments, scientists believe an annual increase of actually 1 to 3 degrees Celsius, which this is very scary. 1 to 3 degrees Celsius is a large amount of temperature change, and this can be extremely deadly to many environments as we go through the years. The climate change will destruct ecosystems. For example, the Amazon rainforest is predicted to see less rain, which will result in a slow demise in the wildlife of the area. Again, this seems like a delicate change, but animals for thousands of years have adapted and evolved for these certain conditions, and now just quickly changing these conditions can be threaten species, ecosystems, and that can this can create a domino effect onto us because if certain species can't survive, then maybe our food chains are the way we get food and resources is destructed as well. So yeah, obviously, I'm no scientist, but climate change is not good for humans in the future, humans or just the world in general. It's extremely threatening. So water salinity. Salinity is the proportion of solutes dissolved in water. So seawater is often more saline than freshwater as it has many salt particles within it. Certain salts are more concentrated in the water because of their solubility in water. Sodium chloride is so soluble that it makes up 86% of sea salt. 97.5% of water is salt water. 2.5% is locked in ice caps and glaciers. Only 0.5% is accessible to humans. So this may seem like an extremely small number, but again, the majority of the Earth is water. So the 0.5%, it's a large percentage of water, but we'll get onto this later. But humans kind of look at, oh, the whole world is made up of water. We can use water. We have so much of it. We can waste as much water as we want. We're fine. But no, only 0.5% of that is accessible to us. So it's actually a lot more scarce than it seems. Even though this 0.5% is a large amount of water, for the whole globe to be using water unconsciously, like using a great amount of water without thinking and without being aware, this is extremely dangerous. So sunlight in water. So the water is its own ecosystem. So sunlight is important just as it is in terrestrial ecosystems. Organisms change as water depth changes because of the scarcity of sunlight. Less than 40% of the sunlight reaches 10 meters into the seawater. This limits what organisms live in what parts of the ocean. Therefore, it has been divided into the intertidal, neritic, oceanic, benthic, photic, and aphotic zones. Coral reefs are some of the most active ecosystems in the oceans. Lakes are also divided into the zones of the littoral and limnetic. So yeah, basically, as we get deeper and deeper into the ocean, there's less sunlight. Therefore, certain organisms can't live at certain points of the ocean because they're accustomed to having a certain amount of sunlight. And this is why we have to divide the ocean into zones. It's not just all one ecosystem. There's like multiple ecosystems within the ocean, and that is why there are these different zones. Coral reefs, very active. That's where that's where a lot of the vegetation is in the ocean, and yeah, just very productive part of the ocean. And the lakes, although they're not on as big a scale as oceans, they also have their zones of littoral and limnetic because again, the sunlight dissipates that quickly that there's different zones in even just a small lake. So water flow. Water flow presents a physical challenge to organisms. Water can very well displace small organisms with its strong stream. Small organisms in streams have adapted to stay planted in water. A new field of biomechanics is studying how this phenomenon affects the ecosystem. The stream of water may also affect oxygen and sunlight availability. So obviously this water flow can be very strong. You can see in this picture how the water is white and bubbling up. This is because it's moving so fast. So small species may have difficulty staying planted in their ecosystems. So they've adapted over time to, have little adaptations that help them stay put to be able to survive. Because if they're getting swept away, I mean, they could hit something, they could easily get hurt, and so they have to adapt to be able to stay put in their environment. And yeah, there's a new field of study that is just studying how this affects the ecosystem because it's a very big part. This may affect where certain organisms live. Like if they haven't adapted to stay planted, they may have adapted to live in a certain part that won't sweep them away. And yeah, as you can see, as the white bubbles up, it may be difficult for sunlight to go through the stream of water. So this just affects productivity in certain parts of the water, and this creates, changes in the ecosystem because of the way the water flows. So nutrients in water. Nutrients can become extremely scarce in water. When organisms die, their bodies and nutrients flow away to other ecosystems. There are multiple ways that organisms can retain nutrients in aquatic ecosystems. So basically, on the land, we see a lot of decomposition. So when an organism dies, there's decomposers that come and absorb those nutrients from the dead organisms. But in the water, this can become more complicated as the water flows away these nutrients. So organisms have to adapt and find other ways to get nutrients in these aquatic systems. So coastal runoff. In large streams, nutrients are scarce. Again, the flowing water makes it difficult for nutrients to stay in place, and it's just very scarce. The water is very large and vast, so it's difficult to find nutrients. Nutrients collect when streams grow more narrow. So basically, in a free-flowing ocean, nutrients are very scarce, but when it becomes very narrow, nutrients may collect on the riverbanks. And yeah, they're just stopped more easily because it is more narrow. This leads to rich estuaries. Estuaries are where freshwater creeks and rivers meet at sea. You can kind of see this here. Um, you can see these streams turning into the ocean over here. So these are the estuaries, very nutrient rich because all the nutrients gather right there. Nutrients gather in these areas because they grow narrow and gather nutrients again. These areas are extremely productive because of the high concentration of nutrients and sunlight. You can even see the change of color here. Those are all nutrients like phosphorus that organisms need to survive and thrive. You can see the change in color. That is why it's so blue out here. It's more dense and nutrient dense in here. There's more things in the water. So yeah, there's lots of productivity, lots of life going on here, lots of interactions between species. Ocean upwelling. So upwelling can cause nutrients to rise to the surface of the ocean. So the nutrients, obviously, they sink in water. This occurs, so upwelling brings these sunken nutrients back up to the surface. So this occurs when wind causes surface water to move and be replaced by the bottom layer of water. So as wind moves away, this water on top of the ocean, the water on the bottom comes up and replaces this top layer. So now there's more nutrients on the top layer of the ocean. Upwelling is nutrient rich because lots of nutrients fall to the ocean floor. Again, the nutrients sink. A type of fish called anchoveta, they're related with anchovies, thrive in upwelling as they receive a large amount of nutrients from this phenomenon. They thrive in areas where upwelling happens constantly. So anchovetas tend to thrive in areas that are very windy because there's that constant upwelling. Nutrients are being resurfaced, and that allows them to feed themselves and become well nutritioned. Um, and yeah, and so lake turnovers. So this is pretty interesting. There are a few natural lakes and ponds in like the areas close to the equator. Um, in the north is where we find most of our lakes and ponds. So they go through this turnover because these lakes and ponds in the north it's colder, so they have to go through freezing periods. Um, So freezing and melting of water causes nutrients to be released. This causes rapid increases in algae and bacteria, spring bloom. So again, when the water melts, um, um, there's an increase in algae and bacteria, and there's just lots of nutrients being circulated in this environment, and that is the spring bloom. Lots of life comes in spring. As the water begins to freeze again, the nutrient-rich water settles at the bottom and waits to be released in the spring. So in the spring, we see all these nutrients come up to the surface, but then once it begins to freeze, we see all the nutrients get trapped at the bottom again because it's frozen and they can't. Obviously, there's a barrier there, so they can't get up to the top. So in the spring we should just see a boom of life basically because there's so many nutrients available to all the life forms in the area. Human effect on aquatic biomes. So contrary to popular belief, our water supply is not unlimited, as I spoke of before. Humans often believe they can use as much water as they want because it will replenish itself. If all water were balled up together, it would only be the diameter of the Gulf of Mexico. So basically, there seems to be so much water in the world, but in a lot of parts it's shallow. So this is basically saying if we balled it up all together, it would only be the size of the Gulf of Mexico. So that much water supplying the whole world, using it without any awareness of how much water there really is, can be quite dangerous. Humans have long treated aquatic biomes as unlimited resources. Again, this is not the case. These are very limited resources over time, and so this has caused many physical, chemical, and biotic changes to these biomes. Again, water is obviously essential, so when we take that away, many organisms suffer, and this is one of the main effects humans are having on not only aquatic biomes but really all biomes because the lack of water in aquatic biomes is just a domino effect again. Everything is interlinked. That is one of the main points of ecology, really. Everything is interlinked, and so just taking one thing away can cause a crazy domino effect that affects everybody. So, history of abuse. Humans have destroyed biomes by draining wetlands, streams, and ponds for agricultures. Humans create aquatic features for aesthetic benefits. Humans transport aquatic organisms into other ecosystems, which throws off the balance of ecosystems. Humans released waste into water systems, causing poisoning and imbalances to ecosystems. Increased CO2 levels are causing sea levels to rise and causing the ocean to acidify. So, Humans, I mean, they're using water from wetland streams and ponds for agriculture to feed ourselves, but that harms these ecosystems because they are scarce on water. Humans create aquatic features for aesthetic benefits, so these are like little man-made ponds. These can be harmful because they displace organisms and they're not really necessary. They just for aesthetic benefits to look at. It's nice to look at, it's nice to be around, but in reality, they're pretty destructive. Humans transport aquatic organisms into other ecosystems. So basically, as I mentioned this before, moving one thing in a food web can just throw everything off again. It's a domino effect. When you remove that organism, it can be someone's competition, someone's food, and it can regulate other species. So just removing that one species can throw everything off for a certain ecosystem. Yeah, humans use water, as you can see in this picture, to dump our waste. And again, this is extremely destructive because now these aquatic organisms have to deal with this waste. It's an added factor that they're not used to. And increased CO2 levels are causing sea levels to rise. This has a lot to do. So the CO2 causes climate change, which causes warmer temperatures, which causes glaciers in the north to melt, which, as we get more water into our seas, the sea levels rise, and this just extremely messes with all types of ecosystems. So thank you for viewing. I hope you learned something about ecology, and yep, uh, thank you so much for watching.